She was on her knees in the hallway, scrubbing the floor with a wet cloth, when she heard her own voice being used as a joke. "Just look," said Professor Richard Calloway, pointing in her direction with a whiteboard marker without even fully turning his face. "Even our janitor knows this problem has no solution. Isn't that right?" The audience laughed. There were at least 200 people in that amphitheater, graduate students, visiting researchers, science journalists covering the most anticipated mathematics seminar of the year in Cambridge. And every single one of them laughed. Diane Ferreira did not lift her head. She simply kept scrubbing the floor slowly, with that calmness people interpreted as indifference, but which was something completely different. Over 11 years cleaning academic hallways, she had learned that the best place to think was exactly there, invisible, ignored, free. No one knew what Diane carried inside that worn brown leather folder that always stayed at the bottom of her cleaning cart. Her co-workers thought they were overdue bills or pictures of her children. The night shift security guard, Antonio, once asked if it was a Bible. She smiled and said it was almost that. They were not bills. They were not photos. They were 9 years of mathematical research she had never shown anyone. Diane had been born in Porto Alegre, the daughter of a seamstress and an electrician who died when she was 14 years old. She had always been good with numbers, not good in the way people praise children, like saying, "How cute, she can count to 100. She was good in a way that frightened teachers, that made adults fall silent in the middle of explanations because they realized the student had already moved 3 steps ahead. At 19, she entered the Federal University with the highest score in the state on the science entrance exam. At 23, she had a partial scholarship in a graduate program in applied mathematics. It seemed the world was finally going to start seeing her. Then her mother got sick. It was not quick. It was the kind of illness that consumes slowly, the person, the family, the savings, the plans. Diane went back home. Her younger brother was 12 and needed someone. The scholarship was suspended. The program continued without her. No professor called to ask what had happened. She found work as a cleaning assistant at a school, then at a hospital. Then, through one of those coincidences that seem impossible but happen anyway, in an outsourced position at the University of Cambridge, where she arrived at 27 years old with 2 suitcases and a brown leather folder whose edges were already beginning to fade. 11 years later, she was still there. But the folder had grown on the inside. While Calloway spoke to the audience about the impossibilities of the Voss equation, an open problem in number theory for nearly 40 years, Diane stopped scrubbing. Not because she was tired, but because she heard the professor say something that was wrong. It was not an opinion. It was a mistake. A premise he used as the foundation for the entire structure of the lecture was based on a false assumption, one she had identified by accident 2 years earlier while reading an article discarded in a classroom trash bin. She had spent weeks checking it, then months, and reached a conclusion she had never shown anyone. She lifted her eyes from the floor for the first time since the lecture had begun. Calloway was proposing an open bet to the public, £50,000 to anyone who could present a verifiable solution to the Voss equation that same week. It was a performative bet, the kind famous academics make when they are absolutely certain no one will win. The problem, he said with the confident smile of someone who had never been contradicted, is genuinely impossible. Not within the mathematical paradigms we know. Diane looked at the equation projected on the big screen. She recognized it immediately. It was almost like recognizing the face of someone you had seen in your dreams for years. At that moment, she did not make any dramatic decision. She did not hear music playing. She simply calculated, as she always did, the probability of continuing to ignore something she knew was true. It was 0. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments what you thought, and which city or country you're watching from. Richard Calloway had not gotten where he was by accident. He was 58 years old, had 3 books published by prestigious academic publishers, and a 22-year history as a tenured professor at Cambridge that included 2 international awards, a lecture at the World Congress of Mathematics, and an unauthorized biography written by a former student whom he had sued and defeated in court. He was the kind of man who filled a room before even entering it, not because of his height, which was average, nor because of his voice, which was too carefully calibrated to sound natural, but because of a kind of social gravity that years of recognition build around certain people. Those who had known him longer said he had not always been like that. Helena Strauss, professor of mathematical analysis and one of the only women in the mathematics department with a permanent position, had studied with Callaway 30 years earlier, when both were doctoral students in the same program. She kept one specific memory of him, a messy-haired young man who spent nights in the library and shared sandwiches with classmates during exams. There had been something genuine about him back then. Something that was gradually replaced by a polished and impenetrable version of himself. The moment Callaway became what he was now had an approximate date, the publication of his second book, when he was 41 years old. The book became an unlikely success for a technical mathematics text. It reached non-fiction bestseller lists in 3 countries, was adapted into a BBC documentary, and turned Callaway into a recognizable name outside academic circles. That kind of thing changes people. Not always for the worse. In his case, it was exactly for the worse. That day's seminar was the launch of what he called his definitive contribution, a series of lectures on the limits of contemporary mathematics, centered on the Voss equation. Callaway had not discovered the equation. It had been formulated in 1987 by a Norwegian mathematician named Astrid Voss, who died 8 years later without solving it. Callaway had built his recent reputation on the thesis that the equation was, by nature, unsolvable, and that this unsolvability itself was an important discovery. It was a comfortable position. You do not need to solve the problem if you convince the world that the problem has no solution. Diane knew that. She had read all of Callaway's articles on the subject, including 2 he had published in restricted access journals, and which she had only managed to read because a visiting researcher had forgotten printed copies in a hallway Diane cleaned every Tuesday night. She picked them up before the garbage collector came by, read them twice the following night, and identified, on the second reading, the fracture. It was not a crude mistake. It was subtle, the kind of thing that goes unnoticed because it is embedded in a premise everyone assumes to be true without verifying it. Callaway had built his argument on a specific property of convergent sequences that he treated as axiomatic. But that property only held within a restricted set of conditions he had never made explicit, perhaps because he had never realized he was assuming them. Diane realized it. And from that point on, for 2 years, she had worked alone, at night, after her brother went to sleep and before the alarm rang at 5:40 in the morning. Calculating, verifying, reworking, always arriving at the same place. The Voss equation had a solution, and she had found it. In that amphitheater, while Callaway concluded the first part of the lecture with a £50,000 bet, Diane stood still with the cloth in her hands for a length of time she could not measure. There was something almost physical about that moment, the feeling of being at a point of no return, even if you had not yet taken the step. She thought about her mother. Not sentimentally, she thought of her concretely, of the specific image of a woman wearing a scarf on her head sitting in a hospital chair saying, "Diane, stop apologizing for existing." She had never fully understood what her mother meant by that. She was beginning to understand now. Then something happened that she had not foreseen in any of the scenarios she had mentally calculated over the past years. Helena Strauss, seated in the second row of the amphitheater, turned her face toward Diane. It was not by accident. It was a direct, lingering look, the kind people give when they recognize something they still cannot name. As if Helena knew, even before having any reason to know, that the woman holding the cleaning cloth was the most important person in that room. Diane did not go home that night. She finished her shift at 6 o'clock, signed the timesheet, changed out of her uniform in the basement locker room, and went straight to the public library that closed at 10 p.m. It was a place she knew better than she knew her own neighbors. She knew which chair had the firmest seat, which outlet in the left corner of the second floor charged faster, which librarian let people stay 5 minutes past closing without complaining. She opened the brown leather folder on the table and stared at the papers for a moment before beginning. There was something she needed to verify. Not because she doubted her own calculations. She had gone through them so many times that she knew them almost by memory, as if they were a song. What she needed to verify was something else, whether there was any possibility of being wrong in a way she had not yet considered. That was the kind of discipline no one had formally taught her. She had developed it alone, out of necessity. When you have no one to review your work, you learn to become your own cruelest reviewer. The solution she had built over 2 years started from an approach no one had tried before because, at first glance, it seemed unnecessarily complex. Instead of working within the set of restrictions explicitly imposed by the Voss equation, Diane had expanded the analytical space to include a class of functions that conventional mathematical literature treated as irrelevant to that type of problem. It was not an obvious decision, but it was exactly the kind of non-obvious decision that opens doors that remain locked to those who follow the most direct path. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping. At 9:40 p.m., the librarian on duty, a white-haired woman named Gertrude, whom Diane had known by name for 6 years, passed by the table and saw the sheets covered in mathematical symbols. She stopped, looked, then looked at Diane with an expression that mixed surprise and something like delayed recognition. "You're a mathematician," Gertrude said. It was not a question. "I'm a janitor," Diane said, without lifting her eyes from the papers. Gertrude stood there for a few more seconds and then walked away without saying anything else. But at 10 p.m., when it was time to close, she passed by Diane's table again and quietly said that the back door would remain unlocked for another 40 minutes. Diane finished at 10:38. What she held in her hands was an 18-page proof, handwritten on ordinary printer paper, that solved an open problem that had remained unsolved for nearly 40 years. There was no way to know, looking at those pages from the outside, what they represented. They looked like nothing more than dense notes from someone who liked mathematics. No one passing by the table that night would have stopped to look twice. That was exactly how Diane had survived for 11 years. By being the kind of thing people do not stop to look at twice. She folded the pages carefully, placed them in the folder, closed the metal clasp that had already become slightly loose, and left through the back door. On the bus ride home, she kept the folder on her lap and her eyes on the dark window. She thought about Calloway. Not with anger. Anger was an emotion she had learned not to waste on people who did not deserve the attention it demanded. She thought about him as a problem. And problems, she knew how to solve. What truly occupied her mind was something else. There was something she still had not told anyone, not even her brother, who was now 23 and worked at a print shop downtown, nor the only friend she had in Cambridge, a nurse named Priscilla who lived in the same building and sometimes left food outside her door when she noticed the apartment lights stayed on too late. Diane had written a letter, 8 months earlier, to the most respected pure mathematics journal in the world. She had sent a preliminary version of her proof, without her full name, using only the initials DF and an email address she had created specifically for that purpose. The letter had come back with a short response. Not a rejection. A question. The editor had written that the approach was unusual enough to deserve attention, and asked whether the researcher could provide a more complete proof for internal review. Diane had read that email 43 times. She knew the exact number because she had counted. She had never replied. Not because she doubted the solution, but because she still did not know whether she was ready for what came after being seen. Now, with Calloway's bet still echoing in her mind, that question had become more urgent. She got off the bus one stop earlier than usual and walked slowly, the folder tucked under her arm, looking at the rain-soaked pavement. At some point, somewhere between one sidewalk and another, she made a decision she did not verbalize even to herself. But when she arrived home, instead of sleeping, she opened her laptop and replied to the editor. The question and answer session on the second day of the seminar began at 2 p.m. Diane entered the amphitheater at 1:58 with the cleaning cart, as she always did before the afternoon sessions. A quick check of the side hallways, collecting cups left behind during the break, checking the adjacent restrooms. It was part of the routine. No one paid attention. Calloway was at the front, speaking with 2 visiting researchers, carrying himself with the posture of someone accustomed to being the fixed point around which everyone else orbited. The room gradually filled. Diane worked slowly, more slowly than necessary, keeping the cart near the left side entrance. It was Helena Strauss who began. She was sitting in the same seat as the previous day and raised her hand even before the moderator formally opened the floor for questions. Calloway acknowledged her with a nod that tried to appear cordial but carried an old tension beneath it, the kind of tension that exists between 2 people who were once equals and one day stopped being so. "Richard," Helena said, without a microphone, in a voice that did not need one. "Yesterday you presented the convergent premise as the foundation of unsolvability. But that premise has a boundary condition you did not make explicit. I want to understand whether that was a choice or an omission." The room fell silent in a very specific way. Not the silence of people who do not understand. The silence of people who do understand and want to see what happens next. Calloway responded with the skill of someone who had spent decades transforming weaknesses into performances. He reformulated the question, expanded the answer, used 3 examples that were technically correct but did not address what Helena had asked. It was a technique. It worked very well with audiences that did not fully master the subject. Helena mastered the subject. "You didn't answer," she said, simply. That was the moment Diane stopped the cart. She had not planned to do it like this. She had thought about waiting until the end, handing the papers to Helena privately, letting someone else, someone with credentials, with a recognizable name, with the right-sized badge, present the work. It was the safest plan. It was the kind of plan she had built her whole life around, efficient, invisible, without unnecessary exposure. But Calloway looked at Helena with a smile Diane had seen before. It was the same smile from 2 days earlier, when he had used her name as a joke. The smile of someone absolutely certain that consequences would never arrive. She opened the brown leather folder. "Excuse me." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. A few heads turned. Calloway did not turn immediately. There was an implicit hierarchy in that gesture, the refusal to give quick attention to someone who did not deserve quick attention. When he finally turned, the smile was still there. "The boundary condition Professor Helena mentioned," Diane said, walking toward the center aisle with the papers in her hands, "was not an accidental omission. It is absent because the entire proof collapses if it is made explicit. And it collapses because the premise is false within the functional space where the Voss equation operates." Silence. "Who are you?" Calloway asked. The smile had changed shape but was still there, now layered with something trying to resemble patience, but actually something else. "I'm the janitor," Diane said. "From Corridor B." She reached the center of the amphitheater and placed the first 4 pages on the presentation table, facing the audience. They were dense, covered in precise notation, organized with a clarity that required no explanation for those who understood what they were seeing. Helena Strauss rose from her chair. She said nothing yet. She simply stood and walked to the table. She looked at the pages for 40 seconds that felt much longer than that. Then she raised her eyes to Diane with an expression that was not surprise, it was recognition. The kind that hurts a little because it arrives too late. "Continue," Helena said. Diane continued. She presented the proof in sections, explaining each transition with an economy of words that came from years of thinking alone, with no one to impress. There was no performance. There was precision. And it was exactly that absence of performance that made it impossible not to pay attention. Calloway tried to interrupt twice. The first time, he questioned the class of functions Diane had used as an extension of the analytical space. She responded with a 3-line counterproof he could not refute in real time. The second time, he claimed the notation was inconsistent with the journal standards. Helena, without taking her eyes off the pages, said, "The notation is correct, Richard." There was a live streaming camera at the back of the room. It was for the department's channel, which normally had 200 simultaneous viewers during major events. At that moment, someone in the comments had written that the number was rising quickly. Then another person. Then the chat began moving too fast to read. Diane did not know that. She was looking at the final page of the proof. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment she could not measure. Then Helena Strauss clapped once, not as applause, but as a period at the end of a sentence. And the room responded in a way Diane had never imagined for herself. Calloway stood at the front with the whiteboard marker still in his hand, staring at the pages on the table. "That is not sufficient for the bet," he finally said. "It would require formal verification by a committee." Helena turned toward him with a calmness more devastating than any direct response. "Then form the committee, Richard. I volunteer as the first reviewer." That was when Calloway changed strategies, and made the greatest mistake of the afternoon. He told the room that Diane was a janitor without a completed degree, that she had dropped out of university, that she had no credentials to present work in any academic forum. He said it with the intention of ending the conversation. But what happened was the opposite. Diane let him finish. Then she said, in the same firm voice as before, "I left my program because my mother was dying and my brother was 12 years old. If that disqualifies the mathematics, then the problem is not mine." The room did not applaud this time. It became silent in a different way, the silence that comes when something true is spoken aloud in a place where people are accustomed to half-truths. Calloway did not respond. The verification committee was formed within 48 hours. It was not Calloway who formed it. It was the department director, a quiet man named Bernard Osei who had watched the seminar broadcast from his own office and arrived at the amphitheater in time to see the last 10 minutes live. He had said nothing that day. He simply collected a copy of Diane's pages carefully, as if they were something fragile, and left. The next day, Diane arrived at work at 6 in the morning as always. She picked up the cart, checked the cleaning supplies, started Corridor A. At 8:40, Bernard Osei found her in Corridor B holding a cup of coffee, for her, not for himself, and asked for 15 minutes. They spoke in a small meeting room Diane had cleaned hundreds of times. She knew every mark on the ceiling, every scratch on the table. Bernard placed the cup in front of her and said he had sent the 18 pages to 3 external mathematicians during the night, people with no connection to Callaway or Cambridge. He had requested a preliminary analysis on an urgent basis, something that normally took weeks and that he had managed to obtain in hours for reasons Diane understood without needing to ask. All 3 had replied before 6 in the morning. Bernard opened the laptop and turned the screen toward her. There were 3 emails. She read all 3. They were technical, precise, full of methodological reservations that were the normal language of that world. But the core of all 3 was the same. The proof was correct. The Voss equation had a solution. And the approach used was, in the words of one reviewer, one of the most original contributions to the field in the last 20 years. Diane read the 3 emails twice, then looked at the coffee, which was still warm. "What happens now?" she asked. Bernard said there were several things that needed to happen, and that she would have control over most of them. The formal publication, with her full name. The public verification by the committee. The matter of the bet, which he himself would manage so it would not turn into a circus. And a conversation he wanted to have with her about the future, if she was willing. She was willing. What Bernard proposed was not a perfect solution wrapped in beautiful paper. It was a real possibility with real rough edges. There was an academic reintegration program for researchers without formal degrees that the university had created 3 years earlier and never truly used. Created under institutional pressure, existing on paper, waiting for someone who made it necessary to use it for real. Diane would be the first. There would be bureaucracy. There would be resistance from people who had not been in the amphitheater that day. It would not be simple. "I know it won't be simple," Diane said. "Simple things I've already solved." Bernard smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. The live stream had reached 47,000 simultaneous viewers at its peak. The full video had been edited by someone in the chat and reposted on other platforms before the seminar had even ended. Within 3 days, it had reached countries Diane had never visited. She learned this from Priscilla, the nurse from upstairs, who knocked on her door the following night holding her phone and wearing an expression that mixed pride and a kind of emotion she did not quite know how to explain. "You're everywhere," Priscilla said. "I've always been everywhere," Diane replied. Nobody looked. Callaway took medical leave 2 weeks later. There was no formal announcement, only an internal notice saying his semester classes would be reassigned. His name would remain on the books he had written. But the narrative he had built around the Voss equation, the narrative that had sustained him for years, had been dismantled in a way no medical leave could repair. Diane felt no satisfaction about that. She felt something closer to indifference, which was worse for him than anything else she could have felt. The email from the journal arrived the same week, the editor who had asked, 8 months earlier, whether she could send a more complete proof. Now he wrote in a different tone, more formal and more careful, requesting permission to publish the complete proof in the next issue with editorial priority. Diane replied in 2 sentences. She said yes and asked that her full name be published. Diane Ferreira. No abbreviations. Helena Strauss invited her for coffee one Thursday afternoon. They spent 2 hours talking, not about mathematics, but about other things. About the cost of choosing to care for someone. About what academia does to people who do not fit the formats it recognizes. About the kind of intelligence the world wastes every day because it is looking in the wrong direction. "What are you going to do now?" Helena asked at the end. Diane thought for a moment. Not about the right answer. About the true one. "I'm going to keep solving problems," she said. "I'm just going to stop doing it in hiding." There was a quiet irony in all of it that Diane recognized, but did not need to verbalize. For 11 years, she had cleaned the hallways through which some of the most recognized minds in academia passed. She had collected discarded notes, overheard conversations nobody bothered lowering their voices for because she was present, absorbed fragments of ideas people threw away as if they were trash. No one had ever wondered what she did with all of that. That is the thing about invisibility that people who have never been invisible do not understand. It does not erase the person. It only erases other people's perception. Inside, the person remains whole. Still thinking, building, solving. Still existing with a completeness that does not depend on any audience to be real. Diane had existed that way for 11 years. The difference now was that the world had finally decided to pay attention. And she had finally decided to let it. If this story reached you somehow, if it made you think, feel, or remember someone, leave a comment sharing what you thought and which city or country you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. Stories like this need to be heard.